On September 8, 1941, German forces captured the town of Schlisselburg on the shores of Lake Ladoga, severing the last land route connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. 872 days later, on January 27, 1944, Soviet forces drove German Army Group North away from the city, ending the longest and most destructive siege in modern military history. Between these dates, Leningrad endured a military blockade that killed an estimated 1.5 million soldiers and civilians, but the city never surrendered. This is the military history of the Siege of Leningrad. The armies that surrounded it, the forces that defended it, the operations that failed to break the blockade, and the final offensives that lifted the siege. To understand the Siege of Leningrad, we must begin not with the siege itself, but with Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union that began on June 22, 1941. Barbarossa was the largest military operation in history, deploying over 3 million German and Axis troops along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The invasion was organized into 3 army groups with distinct strategic objectives. Army Group South would advance into Ukraine, capturing agricultural and industrial resources. Army Group Center would drive toward Moscow, the Soviet capital and transport hub. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, would advance through the Baltic states and capture Leningrad. Leningrad was a strategic prize second only to Moscow. The city was the Soviet Union's second-largest metropolis, with a pre-war population exceeding 3 million. It served as the home base of the Baltic Fleet, giving the Soviet Navy access to the Baltic Sea and threatening German maritime operations. The city's industrial capacity was enormous, with over 600 factories producing approximately 10% of Soviet industrial output, including the new KV-1 heavy tank that was superior to most German armor. Politically, Leningrad held immense symbolic value as the former imperial capital of Russia and the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. Capturing Leningrad would deliver a devastating psychological blow to Soviet morale while eliminating a major military and industrial center. Army Group North consisted of 3 major formations: the 18th Army under General Georg von Küchler, the 4th Panzer Army under General Erich Hübner, and later the 16th Army. Supporting these ground forces were Luftflotte 1, providing air support and reconnaissance, and extensive artillery assets, including heavy siege guns. The total strength of Army Group North at the start of Barbarossa exceeded 700,000 men, with hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and air superiority over the Baltic region. Against this force stood elements of the Soviet Northwestern Front, outnumbered and outgunned, retreating through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia under constant German pressure. The German advance through the Baltic states in June and July 1941 was rapid and devastating. Soviet forces, caught unprepared despite intelligence warnings about the impending invasion, fell back in disorder. The Northwestern Front attempted to establish defensive lines, but was repeatedly outflanked by German mobile units. By mid-July, German forces had captured most of the Baltic states and were approaching the borders of the Leningrad military district. Soviet High Command, recognizing the threat to Leningrad, began organizing defensive positions around the city while simultaneously evacuating industrial equipment and organizing civilian labor for fortification construction. On August 23, 1941, the Northern Front was divided into 2 separate commands: the Leningrad Front, responsible for defending the city and its approaches, and the Karelian Front, defending against Finnish forces advancing from the north. The Leningrad Front initially consisted of the 23rd Army, defending between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, the 48th Army, defending the western approaches to the city, and the 55th Army holding the southern sector. The 8th Army was transferred from the Northwestern Front to reinforce the Leningrad Front's defenses. Total Soviet forces defending Leningrad and its immediate surroundings numbered approximately 500,000 troops by early September, but many were hastily trained militia with limited combat experience and inadequate equipment. Field Marshal von Leeb's strategy for capturing Leningrad evolved as his forces approached the city. Initial plans called for a direct assault to take the city by storm, relying on combined arms tactics that had proven successful in Poland, France, and the early stages of Barbarossa. However, as German forces closed on Leningrad's outer defences in late August and early September, von Leeb faced several problems. His troops were exhausted from 2 months of continuous advance. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers through territory infested with Soviet partisans. Soviet resistance was stiffening as defenders fought with desperation born of defending their homes. Most critically, Hitler was redirecting key mobile units from Army Group North to support Army Group Center's drive on Moscow, weakening von Leeb's offensive capability. On August 29th, German forces captured the town of Magar, severing Leningrad's last railway connection to the rest of the Soviet Union. This was a critical tactical success, cutting the rail line that supplied Leningrad with food, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. 1 week later, on September 8th, German forces captured Schlisselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, completing the land encirclement of Leningrad. The city was now isolated except for water routes across Lake Ladoga and air transport, both vulnerable to German interdiction. The siege had begun. Hitler, informed of the encirclement, issued a directive that would define the siege's character. German forces were not to assault Leningrad directly. Instead, they would surround the city, subject it to continuous artillery bombardment and aerial attack, and starve the population into submission. A directive sent to Army Group North on September 29th stated explicitly that after Soviet defeat, there was no interest in the continued existence of Leningrad's urban population. Requests for surrender negotiations were to be denied. The problem of feeding millions of civilians was not Germany's responsibility. Hitler's ultimate plan was to raze Leningrad to the ground and give the territory north of the Neva River to Finland as reward for Finnish cooperation in the war. This policy of deliberate starvation was not simply military strategy. It was a calculated decision to eliminate an entire city's population through denial of food and resources. German quartermaster calculations suggested Leningrad would reach critical starvation within weeks once supplies ran out. The city held approximately 30 days of food reserves when the encirclement was completed, barely enough to sustain the population even with severe rationing. German artillery would target food storage facilities, utilities, and transportation infrastructure to hasten the city's collapse. Luftwaffe bombers would conduct terror attacks to demoralize the population. The blockade would be maintained indefinitely, preventing any supplies from reaching the city. Under these conditions, German planners believed Leningrad's population would be decimated within months. The Soviet response to the encirclement was to organize defense while attempting to break through the German lines from the outside. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the Soviet Union's most capable commanders, was appointed to lead the Leningrad front in September 1941, replacing Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, who had proven unable to halt the German advance. Zhukov immediately began reorganizing the city's defenses, establishing artillery positions, deploying reserves to critical sectors, and preparing contingency plans for urban warfare if Germans breached the outer perimeter. Zhukov's presence stiffened Soviet resistance, and German attacks that had been advancing steadily began encountering much fiercer opposition. The German ground assault on Leningrad reached its high water mark in mid-September 1941. The 1st Panzer Division advanced to within 12 kilometers of the city center, close enough to see Leningrad's spires and hear the sounds of the city. German artillery began systematic bombardment, firing thousands of shells daily into residential areas, factories, and military positions. The Luftwaffe conducted massive air raids, with 276 bombers attacking on September 19th alone, causing extensive fires and casualties. The psychological impact was severe, but Soviet forces held their defensive lines. German infantry attacks were repelled with heavy casualties on both sides. By late September, it was clear that German forces lacked the strength to storm the city while simultaneously maintaining the encirclement and supporting operations elsewhere on the Eastern Front. Von Leeb's forces settled into siege operations, establishing fortified positions around Leningrad while maintaining constant pressure through artillery and air attacks. The encirclement was not complete in the sense that German and Finnish forces did not physically link up. Finnish forces, advancing from the north, stopped at approximately the line of the old Finnish-Soviet border established after the Winter War of 1939–40. This left a gap between German and Finnish positions that Soviet forces could potentially exploit. particularly around Lake Ladoga. However, crossing Lake Ladoga presented its own challenges. The lake was enormous, exposed to German observation and fire, and accessible to Luftwaffe bombers operating from nearby airfields. The Soviet military situation outside Leningrad was critical. The Volkhov Front, established to coordinate relief operations from the east, launched multiple offensives in late 1941, attempting to break through German lines and reopen land communications with Leningrad. These attacks failed with heavy casualties. The Lyuban offensive operation, conducted from January 7 to April 30, 1942, attempted to breach German defenses south of Lake Ladoga. The operation committed several armies and cost over 300,000 Soviet casualties, but achieved only minimal gains. The Second Shock Army, involved in the offensive, was eventually surrounded and destroyed by German counterattacks, demonstrating the Wehrmacht's continued tactical superiority despite being overstretched. Inside Leningrad, Soviet authorities organized civilian and military efforts to sustain the defense. Over 1 million civilians were mobilized to construct fortifications, dig trenches, build anti-tank obstacles, and maintain defensive positions. The Baltic Fleet, trapped in Leningrad's harbor, contributed its sailors as infantry and its heavy naval guns as artillery supporting the land defenses. The city's factories continued operating despite bombardment, producing ammunition, weapons, and equipment for the front lines. The Kirov plant produced KV-1 heavy tanks that were immediately deployed to defensive positions around the city. Maintaining industrial production required continuous supply of fuel and raw materials, but supplies were dwindling rapidly as the blockade tightened. The only route connecting Leningrad to Soviet-controlled territory was across Lake Ladoga, Europe's largest lake. In summer and autumn, ships and barges carried supplies across the lake from eastern ports to Leningrad's western shore. This water route was dangerous. German artillery positioned near the lake's southern shore could fire on shipping lanes, and the Luftwaffe conducted regular attacks on Soviet vessels. Italian torpedo boats and German landing barges operated on the lake in 1942, attempting to interdict Soviet supply convoys. Despite these threats, Soviet ships continued operations, protected by the Ladoga flotilla and air defense units. The tonnage delivered was insufficient to fully supply the city, but it prevented complete collapse. Winter transformed the supply situation. Lake Ladoga began freezing in November 1941, creating the possibility of an ice road across the lake. Soviet engineers and hydrologists studied ice conditions carefully, knowing that premature use of the ice would result in vehicles breaking through and sinking. The ice needed to reach sufficient thickness to support truck traffic, at least 18 centimeters for light vehicles, more for heavier trucks. Reconnaissance teams ventured onto the forming ice to survey potential routes, facing the constant danger of ice failure and German fire. By mid-November, conditions were judged adequate for light traffic. On November 22, 1941, the first truck convoy crossed the ice of Lake Ladoga. Captain Mikhail Murov led the initial transport regiment, comprising 60 Gaz AA trucks, onto the ice route designated Military Vehicular Road No. 101. The route stretched 27 to 32 kilometers, depending on the specific path chosen to avoid weak ice areas. Drivers operated under strict protocols: maintain low speed to avoid creating pressure waves in the ice, keep doors open to allow rapid escape if the vehicle broke through, maintain minimum 100-meter spacing between vehicles to distribute weight, and follow marked routes precisely. These precautions were essential but could not eliminate all risks. In the first week of operations alone, over 40 trucks broke through the ice and sank, often taking their drivers and cargo with them. The Road of Life, as this ice route became known, faced constant threats beyond the inherent danger of driving on ice. German artillery positions were 12 to 15 kilometers from the route, close enough for long-range guns to fire on convoy movements. Artillery barrages aimed to create holes in the ice that subsequent vehicles would not detect until too late. The Luftwaffe conducted regular bombing runs, targeting both the ice road itself and the loading and unloading points at each end. Soviet air defenses, air patrols, and anti-aircraft artillery worked continuously to protect the route, but could not prevent all attacks. Every convoy faced the possibility of coming under fire, and drivers developed tactics to minimize exposure. driving at night when German observation was limited, spreading convoys across multiple routes to reduce target concentration, and using smokescreens to obscure movements. Soviet logistics personnel organized elaborate systems to maximize the road of life's efficiency. Traffic control posts were established every few hundred meters, manned primarily by women who served as regulators, directing traffic, monitoring ice conditions, and warning of hazards ahead. These regulators worked in brutal conditions, exposed to wind, cold, and enemy fire, standing watch for hours to keep the supply route functioning. By January 1942, 75 traffic control posts operated with 350 regulators managing the flow of hundreds of vehicles daily. The system worked. Despite constant dangers, the Road of Life gradually increased its cargo tonnage as ice thickened and procedures improved. The eastward journey carried evacuees, wounded soldiers, and equipment leaving Leningrad. The westward journey brought food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements into the city. During the first winter of operations, from November 1941 to April 1942, the Road of Life transported 361,000 tons of cargo into Leningrad. This included 262,000 tons of food, 32,000 tons of military supplies, and 37,000 tons of fuel. The road also evacuated 550,000 civilians, primarily women and children, from the besieged city. These evacuations likely saved hundreds of thousands of lives, removing mouths to feed and reducing pressure on limited food supplies. The Road of Life operated until April 24, 1942, when spring thaw made the ice unsafe for vehicle traffic. The final convoy carried 64 tons of onions, delivered just before the ice became impassable. During the spring thaw, truck drivers often drove through standing water on deteriorating ice, knowing that stopping would mean sinking. Lieutenant General Andrei Kozlov recounted transferring 11,000 troops across the lake on April 22nd and 23rd. Half the journey in trucks, the other half wading through icy water as the ice gave way beneath them. Such was the desperation to maintain the supply line. With the arrival of summer, shipping resumed on Lake Ladoga, but the tonnage delivered remained inadequate to fully supply Leningrad's needs. The Soviet command approved construction of an underwater fuel pipeline across the lake bottom in April 1942. Soviet engineers completed this pipeline by June, laying 21 kilometers of pipe at a depth of 12.5 meters beneath the lake. This pipeline delivered petroleum products directly to Leningrad, reducing the need to use precious cargo space on ships and trucks for fuel transport. The pipeline was a remarkable engineering achievement under wartime conditions and significantly improved Leningrad's logistics situation. German forces continued their siege through 1942, maintaining artillery bombardment and aerial attacks, while repelling Soviet relief attempts. In August 1942, Soviet forces launched the Sinyavino offensive, attempting again to break the blockade by driving through German positions south of Lake Ladoga. The offensive involved the Leningrad front attacking westward and the Volkhov front attacking eastward, with the goal of linking up and creating a corridor to Leningrad. The offensive achieved initial successes, advancing several kilometers against strong German resistance. However, German counterattacks halted the Soviet advance, and the offensive was eventually called off in October, having failed to break the blockade. Soviet casualties exceeded 80,000, while German losses were also substantial. The strategic situation remained unchanged. By December 1942, Soviet High Command was planning another attempt to break the Leningrad blockade. This operation, codenamed Iskra or Spark, would be different from previous failed offensives. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, now coordinating multiple fronts as a Stavka representative, oversaw the planning. The operation would benefit from improved Soviet military capabilities, better training, more equipment including American Lend-Lease supplies, improved coordination between fronts, and German forces weakened by demands elsewhere on the Eastern Front, particularly at Stalingrad, where the German Sixth Army was surrounded and dying. Operation Iskra would target the bottleneck area between Lake Ladoga and German fortified positions at Sinyavino, where the distance between the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts was narrowest. The Soviet plan called for a two-pronged assault converging on the bottleneck. The Leningrad front's 67th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mikhail Dukhanov, would attack eastward across the Neva River from Nevskaya Dubrovka. The Volkhov Front's Second Shock Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Vladimir Romanovsky, would attack westward from positions near Gontovaya Lipka. The two armies would link up north of Sinyavino, creating a corridor through German lines that could be widened and secured. The Baltic Fleet would provide naval artillery support, the Ladoga flotilla would support the northern flank, and long-range aviation would conduct strikes against German positions. Soviet forces assembled for Iskra numbered approximately 300,000 troops, with hundreds of tanks and thousands of artillery pieces. German forces defending the bottleneck belonged to the 18th Army under General Georg Lindemann, who had replaced von Küchler in January 1942. Approximately 50,000 German troops held the sector, organized into multiple divisions, including the 96th Infantry Division, the 172nd Infantry Division, and elements of other formations. German defenses were formidable: multiple trench lines, fortified bunkers, extensive minefields, interlocking fields of fire, and defensive depth extending 14 to 15 kilometers. German commanders understood the bottleneck's importance and had spent over a year fortifying the position. However, German troops were tired, under strength from casualties, and lacked adequate reserves to counter major Soviet attacks. Soviet preparations for Operation Iskra included intensive training. The 67th Army had no prior experience assaulting heavily fortified positions across a major river obstacle. Regiments underwent special training at the Toksovsky training grounds, practicing river crossings, assault tactics against fortified positions, and coordination with artillery and armor. Training included moving through artillery firewalls, where advancing infantry followed closely behind rolling barrages. These exercises were designed to minimize casualties while maximizing the shock effect of the assault. Similar training occurred on the Volkhov Front, where Second Shock Army units practiced breakthrough tactics and exploitation of penetrations in enemy defenses. Artillery preparation for Iskra was unprecedented in scale for operations around Leningrad. Soviet forces concentrated over 21,000 artillery pieces along the attack sectors, achieving densities of over 100 guns per kilometer in some areas. This included field artillery, heavy howitzers, mortars, Katyusha rocket launchers, and anti-aircraft guns repurposed for ground support. Naval guns from Baltic Fleet warships and coastal batteries added heavy-caliber firepower. The plan called for a massive bombardment to suppress German defenses immediately before the assault, followed by rolling barrages to support advancing infantry. Soviet gunners spent weeks plotting targets, calculating fire plans, and positioning ammunition. Operation Iskra began on January 12, 1943, with a long-range bomber strike by Baltic Fleet aviation against German command posts. At dawn on January 12, Soviet artillery opened fire across the entire attack front. The bombardment was deafening, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, shells screaming overhead, explosions carpeting German positions. Soviet records indicate 220,000 shells were fired during the initial bombardment, pulverizing German trenches, bunkers, and communications. The noise was audible in Leningrad itself, giving the besieged population hope that relief was coming. After the bombardment lifted, Soviet infantry and armor attacked. The 67th Army launched its assault across the Neva River from positions around Nevskaya Dubrovka. Soviet engineers had prepared pontoon bridges and assault boats under fire during the preceding nights. Despite heavy casualties from German defensive fire, Soviet troops established bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Neva and began advancing into German positions. German resistance was fierce: machine gun fire, artillery concentrations, counterattacks by local reserves. The first day's gains were measured in hundreds of meters, purchased with heavy casualties. The Volkhov Front's Second Shock Army attacked westward on January 12, encountering similar fierce resistance. German defenders, stunned by the artillery bombardment but not destroyed, manned their positions and fought back. Soviet tanks supported the infantry advance, but the forested and swampy terrain limited armor mobility. Minefields channeled Soviet attacks into killing zones where German anti-tank guns waited. The Second Shock Army's advance on the first day was approximately 2 miles on a 7-mile front. Modest gains that nevertheless represented progress against a well-prepared enemy. Soviet forces continued attacking on January 13th and 14th, despite heavy casualties and difficult terrain. Fog limited air support and observation, but Soviet commanders pressed forward, knowing that momentum was essential to prevent German forces from stabilizing the front. The Second Shock Army advanced 23 kilometers by January 16th after breaking through the initial German defensive belt. The 67th Army, fighting across the Neva and through heavily defended positions, made slower but steady progress. German forces fought stubbornly but were gradually pushed back, lacking sufficient reserves to contain both Soviet attacks simultaneously. On January 18, 1943, advance elements of the 67th Army and Second Shock Army linked up at Workers' Settlement No. 5, south of Lake Ladoga. The siege ring was broken. A corridor approximately 8 to 11 kilometers wide had been opened between the two Soviet fronts. German forces still held positions on both sides of the corridor and continued fighting, but the physical connection between the Leningrad front and the Volkhov front had been re-established. For the first time in 16 months, Leningrad had a land link to the rest of the Soviet Union. The immediate priority was consolidating the corridor and establishing secure supply lines. Soviet engineers immediately began constructing a railway line through the corridor, working under continuous German artillery fire and air attack. The railway, connecting Leningrad to Volkhov and the Soviet railway network, was completed in just 18 days, an extraordinary feat of wartime construction. On February 7, 1943, the first supply train arrived in Leningrad from the mainland. The railway remained within range of German artillery throughout 1943, making every supply run dangerous, but it operated continuously despite casualties and damage. Operation Iskra was not complete in the sense that German forces were not destroyed or driven away from Leningrad. The corridor was narrow, vulnerable to German counterattacks, and under constant bombardment. Soviet forces attempted to widen the corridor and drive German forces farther from Leningrad, but these operations in February and March 1943 achieved only modest gains. The Germans launched counterattacks attempting to cut the corridor, including the Battle of Krasny Bor, where Spanish Blue Division troops fought against overwhelming Soviet attacks. These German counterattacks failed to restore the siege, but prevented Soviet forces from achieving their full objectives of destroying German forces in the region. The strategic significance of breaking the blockade was immense. Leningrad's supply situation improved dramatically once the railway was operating, even under fire. Food rations were increased. Fuel deliveries allowed factories to resume operations. Ammunition stockpiles were rebuilt. Reinforcements and equipment flowed into the city. The population, which had endured 16 months of the most terrible privation, gained hope that survival was possible. The Baltic Fleet received supplies and reinforcements, restoring its combat capability. The city that Hitler had planned to starve into collapse within weeks had survived over a year of siege and was now receiving regular supplies despite continued bombardment. Throughout 1943, Soviet forces conducted several operations attempting to drive Army Group North farther from Leningrad and fully lift the siege. These operations achieved territorial gains, particularly in the Sinyavino area, but did not break German defenses decisively. The Germans maintained their siege lines south and southwest of Leningrad, continuing artillery bombardment of the city and the supply corridor. The war situation elsewhere on the Eastern Front turned increasingly against Germany. Stalingrad was lost. Kursk ended in Soviet victory. Ukraine was being liberated. Despite these defeats, Army Group North maintained its positions around Leningrad through 1943, demonstrating continued German defensive capability even as strategic initiative passed to the Soviet Union. By late 1943, Soviet High Command was planning a final offensive to completely lift the Leningrad siege. The Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive would involve multiple Soviet fronts in a coordinated operation to destroy Army Group North and liberate the Leningrad region. Soviet forces available for the offensive had grown substantially. Replacements from liberated territories, new equipment from Soviet and Lend-Lease production, improved training and experience. The offensive would deploy approximately 1.25 million troops, 1,600 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 20,000 artillery pieces including 1,500 Katyusha rocket launchers and nearly 1,500 aircraft. This force would attack along a front exceeding 300 miles, from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ilmen. German Army Group North had approximately 740,000 troops defending against this offensive, but German strength had been bled down through 2 years of continuous combat. Many units were under strength, equipment was worn out, and replacements inadequate. Luftwaffe air support was minimal compared to early war levels, as German aircraft were needed to defend the Reich itself against Allied bombing. German defensive positions remained formidable, with extensive fortifications, but the troops holding them were exhausted and outnumbered. German commanders understood a major Soviet offensive was coming, but lacked the resources to prevent it. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive began on January 14, 1944, with massive Soviet artillery bombardment. The concentration of artillery was unprecedented, 200 guns per kilometer in some sectors, creating a wall of fire that obliterated German forward positions. Soviet infantry and armor attacked immediately after the bombardment lifted, before German forces could recover. 3 Soviet fronts participated, the Leningrad Front attacking from the north, the Volkhov Front attacking from the east, and the Second Baltic Front attacking Army Group North's southern flank. The attacks were coordinated to prevent German forces from shifting reserves between threatened sectors. Initial Soviet progress was slower than planned due to fierce German resistance and difficult terrain, but the weight of Soviet forces gradually overwhelmed German defenses. The Second Shock Army, attacking from the Oranienbaum pocket west of Leningrad, advanced rapidly once it broke through German lines. The 42nd Army, attacking from the Pulkovo heights south of Leningrad, pushed German forces back despite counterattacks. By January 19th, Soviet forces had captured the towns of Krasnoye Selo and Ropsha, key German strongpoints. The German 18th Army was in full retreat, attempting to establish new defensive lines farther from Leningrad. Soviet forces pressed the offensive throughout late January, pursuing retreating German forces and preventing them from establishing stable defensive positions. The 67th Army advanced toward Mainya, the town whose capture in 1941 had severed Leningrad's last rail link. The recapture of Mainya on January 21st restored direct rail communications between Leningrad and Moscow. Other Soviet units advanced toward Novgorod, Luga, and other objectives, liberating hundreds of towns and villages. German forces conducted fighting withdrawals, attempting to preserve their units while inflicting maximum casualties on advancing Soviet forces, but could not prevent the steady Soviet advance. On January 27, 1944, Soviet forces drove German forces entirely out of artillery range of Leningrad. The siege was officially declared lifted after 872 days. Leningrad celebrated with a 324-gun salute, the city's population emerging from shelters and basements to witness the end of the longest siege in history. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive continued into February, pushing Army Group North westward and liberating the entire Leningrad Oblast. Soviet forces advanced to the borders of Estonia, securing Leningrad's approaches and ensuring German forces could never again threaten the city. The siege's military significance extended beyond Leningrad itself. Army Group North tied down substantial Soviet forces throughout the siege. The Leningrad Front, Volkhov Front, and later the Baltic fronts required millions of troops, thousands of guns, and extensive resources simply to contain German forces and eventually lift the siege. These forces could not be deployed elsewhere on the Eastern Front, where they might have accelerated Soviet offensives. From this perspective, the siege achieved a strategic purpose for Germany despite failing to capture the city. However, Army Group North itself represented significant German forces, hundreds of thousands of troops, substantial artillery and armor, and Luftwaffe support that were committed to a siege rather than mobile operations. When Soviet forces finally drove Army Group North away in 1944, those German forces had been worn down through 2.5 years of positional warfare and were never fully reconstituted. The tactical lessons of the siege were significant for both sides. Soviet forces learned that well-defended urban positions could be held with relatively limited forces if the defenders were determined and received adequate supplies. The Road of Life demonstrated that even tenuous supply lines could sustain a surrounded force if managed effectively and defended vigorously. Operation Iskra showed that coordinated multi-front offensives with proper artillery support could break through heavily fortified positions. For German forces, the siege demonstrated the limitations of starvation as a siege tactic. Populations could endure far more hardship than anticipated if leadership maintained order and supplies continued even at minimal levels. The failure to completely encircle Leningrad, leaving Lake Ladoga as a supply route, proved critical to Soviet survival. The winter warfare aspects of the siege merit particular attention. Both the Road of Life and the military operations occurred in some of the harshest winter conditions on Earth. Temperatures regularly fell below -30 degrees Celsius. Ice, snow, and extreme cold affected every aspect of operations. Weapons froze, vehicles would not start, soldiers suffered frostbite, visibility was limited. Both Soviet and German forces adapted to winter warfare through trial and error, developing techniques for winter combat, maintaining equipment in extreme cold, and sustaining troops in winter conditions. The Soviet advantage in winter warfare, earned through their Winter War experience against Finland and early Barbarossa experience, played a role in the defense of Leningrad and the eventual breakout operations. The artillery warfare around Leningrad represented some of the most sustained bombardment of World War II. German artillery fired tens of thousands of shells into Leningrad throughout the siege, targeting infrastructure, military positions, and civilian areas indiscriminately. Soviet counter-battery fire attempted to suppress German guns, but could not silence them entirely. The artillery duel continued for over 2 years, with both sides constantly adjusting fire plans, relocating guns to avoid counter-battery fire, and attempting to achieve fire superiority. The concentration of artillery for Operation Iskra and the final offensive showed Soviet mastery of mass artillery operations, a capability that would characterize Soviet operations for the remainder of the war. The aerial warfare over Leningrad involved constant combat between the Luftwaffe and Soviet air defense. German bombers attacked the city, the supply routes, and Soviet military positions throughout the siege. Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, and naval air defense units fought to protect Leningrad and the supply lines. By 1943 and 44, Soviet air superiority over the Leningrad area was established, with hundreds of Soviet aircraft supporting ground operations while German Luftwaffe units were withdrawn to defend Germany itself. This shift in air power balance contributed significantly to Soviet offensive success in 1944. The Leningrad siege's place in military history is defined by its duration, scale, and ultimate outcome. It was the longest siege in modern warfare, exceeding even famous sieges of earlier eras. The casualties were staggering. Estimates suggest 1.5 million total deaths, military and civilian combined, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. Despite this horrific toll, the city never surrendered. Soviet forces maintained organized resistance throughout the siege. The civilian population contributed to defense efforts despite extreme hardship. When Soviet offensives finally lifted the siege, Leningrad remained in Soviet hands, its defenders victorious despite 2.5 years of isolation and bombardment. The siege demonstrated several principles of military operations that remain relevant. First, that urban defenders with adequate fortifications, determined leadership, and even minimal supplies can resist overwhelming besieging forces for extended periods. Second, that supply logistics are crucial to siege warfare. The Road of Life, inadequate as it was, provided just enough supplies to prevent collapse. Third, that relief operations require careful planning, coordination between multiple forces, and overwhelming force to break through prepared defensive positions. Fourth, that sieges are resource-intensive for both sides, consuming troops, ammunition, and supplies that might be employed more effectively elsewhere. The lifting of the Leningrad siege in January 1944 marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. German forces were in retreat everywhere. Ukraine had been liberated, Belarusia was being cleared, the Baltic states would soon be reconquered. Army Group North, driven away from Leningrad, would continue retreating through 1944 and early 1945. eventually surrendering in Courland in May 1945. The city that Hitler had intended to destroy completely would survive, be rebuilt, and remain one of the Soviet Union's great cities throughout the Cold War and into modern times as St. Petersburg. The military legacy of the siege of Leningrad endures in military education and historical study. The defensive operations that held German forces at bay in September and October 1941 are studied as examples of urban defense. The Road of Life is examined as a case study in logistics under extreme conditions. Operation Iskra demonstrates breakthrough operations against fortified positions. The final offensive shows coordinated multi-front operations at Army Group scale. Every aspect of the siege offers lessons for military planners and historians examining the conduct of modern warfare. The siege stands as testament to human endurance, military determination, and the terrible costs of total war.